Thank you for joining us. We are now beginning this evening's event.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's session. It's time to rethink vape, teen vaping risks in 2020. I'm Kelly England. I'm a professor and director of pediatrics in the director of the Pediatrics Division of Community Health and Research at Eastern Virginia Medical School. I also direct the Rethink Vape team. In partnership with EVMS, tonight's event is co-sponsored by the Consortium for Infant and Child Health and the Virginia Tobacco Control Program. Funding is provided by the Virginia Foundation for Healthy Youth. Tonight we'll begin with a 30-minute presentation covering the dangers of teen vaping, why every teen is at risk, and how to recognize the signs and devices. Details about vaping and COVID-19, and more. This presentation will be followed by an hour-long question and answer session with a variety of pediatric, public health, and tobacco prevention experts from Eastern Virginia Medical School, Virginia Department of Health Tobacco Control Program, Children's Hospital of the King's Daughters, and the Consortium for Infant and Child Health. Please submit your questions now or anytime during this event by using the comments or the chat area of the Facebook or YouTube platform in which you are viewing. To get us started, I'll introduce our three speakers who will give us an overview of teen vaping risks. Following this presentation, I'll introduce the rest of our panelists and open it up for questions. Our first speaker is Sally Goodquist. And she's the Northwest Regional Tobacco Control Coordinator for the Virginia Department of Health, based in Charlottesville. Sally is responsible for providing technical assistance and support for tobacco-free policies, promoting assistance and support for promoting cessation services and resources, and keeping folks up to date on the latest trends and health information about tobacco use. She's also the Deputy Public Information Officer and Coordinator for the COVID-19 hotline at the Thomas Jefferson Health District. Our second speaker tonight is Emily Gordon. Emily is a research assistant in the Pediatrics Community Health and Research Division at EVMS. She earned a Master's of Public Health degree from EVMS and Old Dominion University and specializes in social behavioral science and health promotion and education. Her current work focuses on youth e-cigarette prevention, smoke-free housing, and youth mentoring program. And third, our last speaker before we go to the panel is Ann Edwards. Ann Edwards is a research assistant at EVMS in the Pediatrics Community Health and Research Division. She is part of the RETHINKVAPE.org team with expertise in health behavior. Ann studied health psychology and received her Master of Science at Old Dominion University, where she is also currently pursuing her doctorate. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Sally Goodquist, who will start it off with our presentation, and I'm going to share my slides again.
Thank you, Kelly. Good evening, everyone. So I'm going to give a brief overview to get us started today. So as you're likely aware, we've seen rates of vaping among young people rise quite sharply, especially since 2017, which, as you can see on the graph, is when Juul, which was the most popular e-cigarette or vape on the market, really entered the scene and has since kind of fallen out of disfavor, but was very popular for quite some time. And it rose to the point where we saw 1 in 4 high school students were self-identifying as a regular cigarette or vape user. Youth are, of course, much more likely to use vapes these days than they are to smoke. And we're really concerned about the health impacts of vaping. Next slide. So we're especially concerned as we are in the midst of COVID-19, a respiratory pandemic. COVID-19 is, of course, a respiratory illness, and that means that it attacks the lungs. So we know from many years of research on smoking that tobacco use can lead to complications or more severe illness when people get sick with respiratory illnesses. A handful of studies since COVID-19 has been around has shown us that smoking leads to a negative progression of the disease, which means more medical interventions such as needing a ventilator and more likelihood of death as well. So we don't know as much about the long-term impacts of vaping in general, and we definitely don't know a lot about vaping's impact on COVID-19 currently. But we do know that, like smoking, vaping damages the lungs. It harms the tissue, leaves it more fragile and vulnerable to illness. And we know for sure that lungs like good, clean air. They're not meant to inhale anything but air. So inhaling chemicals, especially during the respiratory pandemic that we're facing, is really harmful. In addition to those concerns, we're also concerned about how smoking and vaping requires you to bring your hands to your face, which is something we've been told early on since the start of this pandemic we should avoid to avoid spreading germs and coming into contact with the virus. We also know that youth habits around vaping really rely heavily on them sharing devices. That may be less of a concern now because young people aren't in school and they aren't probably seeing each other as much because most people are still quarantining at home. But that definitely is something that we're aware of. And then another thing is that using tobacco products and vaping can lead to more coughing and spitting. So that's another concern where there might be more chances of exposure to COVID-19. And so sort of to recap that, what we know from initial studies is people who smoke are at higher risk from having severe complications from COVID-19. That doesn't necessarily mean that they are more likely to contract COVID-19. That is a possibility, but we don't have necessarily the scientific research to show us that. And we definitely don't have that information yet for vaping. But we do know that there is no safe tobacco or nicotine product, and now especially is a great time for people to quit. So we'll be talking more about cessation resources later on in the presentation, but quitting is definitely the best thing that you can do to protect your own health. So on the previous slide, there was showed a little bit about stress, and I definitely want to acknowledge that this is a definitely stressful and uncertain times that we are facing for young people. There are probably lots of fears about what will school look like for them in the fall. Are they missing all these rites of passage that would normally be occurring during the spring and summer? Are their families at risk? When will they see their friends? Those kinds of things. And we know when you're trying to quit vaping or smoking or have recently quit, that stress can be a real trigger to pick it up again or to smoke or vape more frequently. And a lot of young people are drawn to vaping because they enjoy the sort of like dopamine release that happens when you get that initial hit of nicotine. But what we know about nicotine addiction is that over time, those pleasurable feelings and chemicals are reduced, and you need the nicotine just to feel normal. And we know that young people are really afraid of the idea of becoming addicted to nicotine. And certainly over time, that actually adds to your stress because as you begin to experience those withdrawal symptoms, which are very unpleasant, it really can be harmful to young people. And so we're concerned about stress as a potential trigger. And I also want to mention the other lung illness that we were very concerned about and sort of emerged around this time last year was a mysterious illness called EVALI, which ended up hospitalizing about 2,800 people. The CDC is still investigating this. It was found to be linked predominantly to what's called vitamin E acetate, which is an additive to mostly THC, or the psychoactive ingredient in marijuana. But it hasn't been ruled out yet that other vaping products could also cause this lung injury, and the CDC is still monitoring this very carefully. And we know that it could potentially really complicate COVID-19 as well, to have these two potential comorbidities. So it's something we're really aware of. So that's my brief overview. I'm now going to kick it off to Emily Gordon from EVMS to talk about how we got here with the youth vaping epidemic.
Thanks, Sally. So she posed the question, how did we get here? And really, it's three things. So it's the vaping trifecta. It's ads, flavors, and nicotine. The ads and social media influencers got teens' attention. The flavors got them to try vapes, the devices make it easy to hide, and the nicotine kept them coming back. Next slide, please. So it's not a surprise that adults and teens might use different language to describe the same thing. So to be on the same page, to know how to speak with teens about this, you kind of have to know some of the lingo. So for example, they may not consider the devices e-cigarettes. I consider them vapes, or say I'm juuling, I'm not vaping. And that's important to keep in mind when you're speaking with them, so they know what they can think that you know what you're talking about at least. And really, the point is to get them at least started to talk. Next slide, please. So we have some devices here, some other items you might see in a teen's backpack or on a desk. So I just want everybody to take a minute or take a few seconds to look at how many devices and vapes do you think you can see? And the next slide will show exactly how many are on the table. So did you get it right? Was that how many you thought it might be? Some of these can look like everyday items. They can look like things that hide in plain sight. And I can show you all some. As you can see on the table, there's a Juul, which kind of looks like a flash drive. You can charge it in any USB port. It's portable. One of these pods is, we've heard, anywhere from equivalent to a pack of cigarettes to 2 packs of cigarettes. So 300 puffs, it depends on how fast they're using them. Some kids want a week, one a day. And you really want to be mindful because these do contain nicotine. Next slide, please. So here, and you can minimize the slide, and I'll just show you, I'm not going to talk too much about them, but I just want to show everybody that some of these things are meant to look like wearable items, fashion accessories, which really appeals to teens. You can, get skins for them and make them look like, match your tech. The chargers and different things can look like candy, can look like other chargers. This one is a smartwatch, also a vape. And all of these, the thing to keep in mind, here's one you can throw away. The disposables are kind of the more prevalent ones they're seeing now, as Sally mentioned. They can look like makeup, just anything. And that's the difference between regular cigarettes, is that a pack of cigarettes, you know what that looks like. Next slide, please. So these are the smartphones of vaping. That's because they come out with new generations of them. As I mentioned, as soon as one comes around, that one's kind of on the out and the next one's coming in. These really started as more like tech startups than they did tobacco products or nicotine delivery systems. Big tobacco companies are selling less cigarettes, or their customers, let's be honest, are dying from using their product. So they're investing in cigarette or e-cigarette or vaping companies and products, or the e-liquids. They're making their own as well. Every big tobacco company has their own vape or multiple. And remember the trifecta that adds nicotine or the adds and flavors and nicotine? That's what hooked kids on cigarettes. And that's what we're seeing is happening now with vapes. And we'll talk more about nicotine content in a minute. So ads appeal to youth like in traditional cigarette advertising, as you can see. For these happen to be Juul ads, but they're so similar to some of the tobacco company ads that are now banned for youth. They're not supposed to be shown in places like in kids' TV shows and things like that. However, it's still evolving for vapes. So they're not under the same kind of regulation as of right now. Hopefully that will be changing soon. Next slide, please. Thank you. So what's in the vapor? And it's not vapor at all. It's not harmless water. It's actually aerosol. So chemicals can travel deeper inside the lungs, and they can be harmful. It can cause lung problems, as Sally was saying. It could be irreversible. They haven't been around long enough for us really to know that that's going to happen. But it's something to consider and keep in mind. Also, it has compounds that are known to be linked to cancers. Flavors themselves aren't safe. So you think, oh, I can eat this, it's in food, but that's tested at certain levels. It's not tested when it's heated the same way to know if that's safe or unsafe in your body. But when it's heated, it's not the same thing. You think of chemistry class, science class, you add heat to something, it changes it. And a lot of the kids don't realize, oh, it's it doesn't have nicotine. Well, that's one thing to consider, but also the flavors themselves are harmful. And it has other things too. So it can have something called diacetyl, which was shown in factory workers to cause something they called popcorn lung, which, not that it looks like that, but it's kind of resembles COPD, in that the workers that were making this microwavable buttered popcorn were inhaling it, and it was causing like a lung injury that vapors are now seeing. People who use vapes are now seeing if it contains diacetyl, for example. It can also cause something called cobalt lung, which is seen in metal workers, where the shavings, if they inhale them, it can cause issues in their lungs. But that's also being seen from the metal coils in people who use vapes. Other toxicants like formaldehyde, which you've heard of, other things, acrolein, toluene. And then, as Sally also mentioned, there could be unknown cutting agents, things that where if you add something to this product, it creates more product and you can, essentially sell more. Vape companies are submitting to the FDA for review, but currently they're not regulated. And a lot of teens might be getting them from peers or other people where they're making them. So even if regulation were to catch up with the amount that people are using these vapes, they're still going to have, illicit kind of street products as well. And I'm going to kick it over to Anne now, who, as I mentioned, we're going to talk more about some nicotine that are in these vapes. So thank you.
Thanks, Emily. I want to talk first about nicotine, which is probably what most people think of when they think of tobacco products. For a long time, our youth did not think that vaping had nicotine in it. As Emily said, they considered this harmless water vapor. But almost all vape products have some level of nicotine in them, even if they are marketed as nicotine-free. As you've heard Sally and Emily mention, these are not regulated products at the moment, so essentially they can put anything they want to on the packaging. But the FDA is beginning the regulation process, so hopefully that will cut down on some of that. But the nicotine in vape liquid is really different than the nicotine that you might think of in traditional cigarettes. It's in a chemical form called nicotine salts, which is absorbed really easily by the body. And if you've ever tried a cigarette and had a horrible coughing fit the first time you did it, nicotine salts take some of that away. It's easier to breathe in. We have to learn how to use cigarettes, and we have to learn how to use a vape device. Neither of these are natural behaviors. Nicotine salts makes this a much easier behavior to learn. What you might be interested to know is that the brain keeps growing until you're 25 years old. So if you're using any chemical that is not designed for your body to use, it does impact the structures of the brain as it develops. We do know a lot about nicotine, actually, and nicotine has permanent consequences on a developing brain. It impacts memory. It impacts learning. It impacts your ability to pay attention. And it teaches your brain really things that are hard for you to overcome in later life. So it primes the addiction. Your brain gets really used to those happy chemicals that Sally talked about. So if you're not providing them with tobacco, then your brain kind of pushes you on to find other things that are going to have these happy chemical releases in your body. If you paid attention to what was going on during the vaping lung epidemic, you might have heard it referred to, or EVALI as the CDC refers to it, a lot of people were saying, but Jules all over the world. And other places aren't having a problem with it. One thing interesting is that Juul in the United States is at a much higher nicotine concentration than it is in any other country. Because it's currently not regulated, Juul can be at 5%. And even though Juul is no longer the most popular, it did start this trend of really high nicotine concentrations. Next slide, please. We've all heard of secondhand smoke with cigarettes. So if somebody next to you was smoking a cigarette, you were breathing in the smoke. The same thing happens with e-cigarettes or vape devices. Even though it's not smoke, it's aerosol, you're still breathing in the aerosol that the person next to you who's using a vape device is putting out into the atmosphere. Probably not really big clouds or anything like that. Those are the more old school ways of looking at vape. The ones that your teenagers are using are very small and very discreet. You won't see the cloud, but you'll still breathe it in. Because it is an aerosol, it gets all over the surface of anything around it. So if you have a toddler maybe at home or a pet and they touch a table that has had vape aerosol on it and then put it in their mouth, they're at risk of nicotine toxicity. There has been an increased amount of poison control calls around e-liquid. It doesn't take very much at all for a toddler, say, to get a severe poison reaction. I think it takes less than 1 teaspoon of vape liquid to have possibly fatal results to a 1-year-old, for example. These are also devices that are producing a lot of heat. They're battery operated, and as we know, batteries sometimes are not stable, and especially with teens who are hiding these devices. They might hide them in the car. Here in Virginia, the inside of a car gets really hot. Heat degrades plastic, heat degrades the battery, and there have been burns and other injuries as a result. Next slide, please. Usually when we go to present in person, one of the questions we usually get, almost always get, is about CBD. In Virginia, it is not legal to use THC products, but you do see CBD advertised. It falls under the same thing. You have to be 21 in the state of Virginia to purchase any of these products legally. CBD is non-psychoactive, where THC is the more psychoactive, what you might think of as cannabis. Think Colorado, okay? We're Virginia, so it's not legal at the moment. But as Emily and Sally both talked about, the cutting agents, we have a picture on screen of one particularly popular one called Honeycut, which made the CBD liquid thicker and gave a better effect for the product. But people were doing these in their bathroom. They were making basically bootleg. And you didn't know what they were cutting it with, which is part of the problem with the Valley. It seemed to have a very detrimental effect on lungs. Next slide, please. So we always get asked, what are the signs of my teen vaping? Well, the problem is the signs that I can tell you for your teen to be vaping might just be the signs of them being teenagers. But scents and smells, really popular fruit flavors, candy flavors, but those also could be anything else your teen's using. Tech and accessories, the latest cell phone always. Same thing with vape devices. They want the latest and the best. So if you're seeing extra chargers, things that you don't recognize, Juuls are actually longer than a USB device. So if you see something that doesn't seem quite right to you, you need to investigate it. Are they spending more money and you can't see what they're spending the money on? Has their behavior changed? Because nicotine withdrawal in particular might lead to irritability and other things, because our teammates are probably not used to nicotine. And with Juul and some of the others having such a high nicotine content, they might have signs of nicotine toxicity. So they're getting a lot of headaches, they're nauseous, their mouth and inside of their nose is really dry. They might not need that caffeine hit they usually start the morning off with because they're getting that adrenaline hit from using a vape device. And it's really important to know that all of our teens are vulnerable to this. We're seeing this with AP students, with star athletes, musicians. Every teen is at risk of vaping. Next slide, please. It's important. Start a conversation before you find the vape device. Ask your child what they've heard about it. Have they seen it in schools? Now that our children are virtually attending school sometimes, what are their friends doing? Do they see their friends using it when they're FaceTiming them or when they're socially distancing across the street talking to each other? Talk to them early. Middle school is not too early to begin this conversation. And it should be a conversation. I know, I'm a mom. I get it. They do something that disappoints you, and your first reaction is probably to be angry with them because of it. You know it's dangerous, and you don't want them to do something dangerous. But in this, you have to remember this isn't a behavior that they can just quit. They might very well be addicted, and you cannot punish an addiction out of a teenager. It's going to take work on their part as well as your part, and perhaps involving your family practice. If there's an adult in the home who has switched to vaping, it's really important that that adult doesn't fear the vaping so much that they go back to combustible cigarettes. We know decades of research on combustible cigarettes. But you should explain to them that you're an adult and you can make adult decisions, but that for anyone 21 or younger, it is not illegal behavior in Virginia, and you would rather that they made different choices. Next slide, please. So, SpongeBob wants you to start early, talk often, practice it. If you have to speak in public like we are today, I always rehearse what I'm going to say. People might look at me funny in the car talking to myself, but I practice. Practice how you're going to talk to your teen. Do it in the car. People will just think you're talking on the phone. It's okay. Next slide, please. There are really great resources that exist. There are text options that your teen can use. They don't call and talk to people, they text. So there are whole programs designed around that behavior, in particular to help your teen manage nicotine withdrawal and to stop using vape liquids. And I know this is a lot of information, but I'm going to give you a really easy way to remember it on the next slide. Or not quite the next slide. Benefits of quitting. It's all about the money sometimes. These are not cheap. The disposable ones can cost, admittedly, under $10, but it adds up over time. And there's so many better things to spend your money on than vaping. So you might possibly point out some of the really good things that they could use their allowance for or what they've earned in a job for. You're going to breathe better. So if you're a musician, you'll play your instrument better. If you are a theater major, you'll be able to project to the back of the house. Singers will be able to hold a note. Athletes will certainly improve their performance if they're not using vape products. Next slide, please. All you really need to remember is rethinkvape.org. We have all of these resources and a whole lot more for doctors, nurses, parents, educators, and teens on our website. You can find all of this there. So if you don't remember anything else, remember rethinkvape.org. Next slide, please. The reach out, we're always here, even if we're working virtually at the moment. You can contact us at the Vape Study EVMS email down at the bottom, or you can contact us through rethinkvape.org for more information, and we will gladly either provide you with the answer or send you in the direction of someone who does know the answer. So I am going to turn this back over to Kelly who is going to start our question and answer period tonight, but I really appreciate you taking your time to listen to us. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Anne, and thank you all for that wonderful and informative presentation. We'd like to now open it up for audience questions. Please, we invite you to enter your questions in the comments or chat box on the Facebook or YouTube platform that you are viewing. While you're entering your questions, I'll go ahead and introduce the rest of our panelists who will be joining our speakers for the question and answer session. First, I'd like to introduce our moderator for the question and answer session, and that is Sarah Rothenberg. Sarah Rothenberg is the Assistant Director of the Consortium for Infant and Child Health, and she's an instructor of pediatrics at EVMS. Sarah holds an MPH in health policy from the George Washington University, where she worked on state and national health reform with a focus on health inequities. Sarah currently directs several community-engaged initiatives with a focus on youth tobacco prevention, early childhood education, breastfeeding, and oral health. We welcome 4 additional panelists who will join our speakers in answering your questions. First, Dr. Paul Harrell is an associate professor at EVMS in the Division of Community Health and Research. He has a doctorate in psychology with additional fellowships in drug dependence, epidemiology, and behavioral oncology. His expertise is in e-cigarette pharmacology, substance abuse treatment, and tobacco control. Next, we have Dr. John Harrington. Dr. John Harrington is a board-certified pediatrician with over 25 years of private and academic practice in New York and Virginia, and is a previous Robert Wood Johnson Fellow for Primary Care Research, as well as a HRSA Mentor for General Pediatric Research. He's the Division Director of General Academic Pediatrics at the Children's Hospital of the King's Daughters and a professor at EVMS. His expertise is in autism and mental health, and he has also been trained as a smoking cessation specialist. Next, we have Nicole Mayan. Nicole works with the Virginia Department of Health, specifically the Tobacco Control Program. She serves as the regional coordinator for the Eastern region. Her work focuses on tobacco prevention and providing information about the Virginia State Quit Line, Quit Now Virginia, a free cessation resource, which Anne just mentioned a moment ago. Finally, we have Amy Paulson. Amy Paulson is an instructor in the EVMS Department of Pediatrics and also the director of the Consortium for Infant and Child Health at EVMS. She has expertise in pediatric public health with a special focus on tobacco, asthma, and respiratory health education, programming, and community action. I welcome all of our panelists and will now hand it back over to Sarah for our first question. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Kelly. So a Facebook viewer shares and asks, I started when I was 14 or 15, don't judge. I'm 18 now and I know I have an addiction. I've tried to stop, but the next day I'm always angry and craving nicotine. I've gone a week with a hit or 2 a day and I could feel my breathing change. I want to quit, but all my friends vape and it's not as easy as you think. What should I do? So a big question, maybe to Anne and Emily and maybe Dr. Harrington.
Well, we certainly do want to hear from Dr. Harrington, but there are really good resources. And what your questioner needs to remember is that it takes most people multiple attempts to quit. So don't feel bad if you can't do it right away. It can take 10 or more real solid attempts to quit. So there are good resources that you can do. If you can talk to an adult and maybe agree on a quit date so that you can get some support. It is really hard. If your friends are doing it too, no one's going to tell you that it's going to be easy, but it is something that you can do. And hopefully Dr. Harrington might have some really good ideas.
Thanks for that segue. So, it really is difficult. Growing up, all of my family members smoked. So I was able to get them all to quit eventually, even before they turned 60. So, but the issue is it's persistence, right? So one of the things to do is to realize how much nicotine you're taking in, and then we can figure out a nicotine replacement therapy for you. So there are patches and gum that people use, and most people do not know how to use them correctly. So a lot of times we can go over that with you. But in the old days when it was combustible cigarettes, usually each cigarette equals about 1 milligram of nicotine. So depending on how much you're vaping and how much nicotine you're taking in daily, we then have to calculate how many milligrams that is. So, if it was 5 milligrams, you'd probably use a 7 milligram patch. If it was 14 milligrams, it would be a 14 milligram patch. And if you were smoking equivalent to 1 pack of cigarettes, it would be a 21 milligram patch that you would use. Now, most people have environmental triggers for nicotine. So, as you were saying, you need to take a hit when you first wake up, or you need to take a hit if you're having some coffee, or you need to take, one, after to go to the bathroom. Even some people need it for their gastrocolic reflexes and stuff. So those are the times that you would use gum. And the gum we usually use is a chew, chew, chew. It'll tingle a little bit, and you park it in your gum. You don't chew it like regular gum. Otherwise, it'll make you feel nauseous. So those are sort of some of the high points of, nicotine replacement therapy. You should also probably see your doctor. If you don't have a pediatrician, you could see a family medicine person, but we can see you, in terms of pediatricians who are trained in that. Not all pediatricians are trained in nicotine replacement therapy. So, you may have to find someone who does do that specifically. And you may have to ask that when you ask to make an appointment or something. But I will say that nicotine replacement therapy is over-the-counter medicine. It's not something that you do need a prescription for. If you do have a prescription and you have, what was previously known as Obamacare, you could get the prescriptions free. And so therefore you wouldn't have to pay for it.
Great, thank you. A YouTube viewer asks, is there a website where we can get more information?
RETHINKVAPE.org.
Yes.
/resources if you want resources. Quitting 1-800-QUIT now. You can text quit to 88706. You can consult smokefree.teen.gov. I guess it depends specifically. More information, like if you have specific things you're looking for, but those are the big ones that I could think of. Oh, and someone also suggested social media pages.
The 1-800-QUIT now can sometimes supply free nicotine patch and gum as well. So they'll sometimes send you a starter pack if you needed it and stuff. So that's another way to get some, support.
Great, thank you. Another Facebook viewer asks, will the slides be available after for educational purposes? And also, will the slides be available for educational distribution? I'm sorry, maybe to Emily or Ann, and maybe Kelly to speak on that.
I can chime in. I have no problem with sharing the slides for education, and we can make them available through, we can post them on our Rethink Vape website in the resources section, as well as in our on the event site. We'll put a link, if not the recording there, if we're able to put it right where the event is. I don't know if Sally and Ann and Emily want to chime in on that.
I will note that we can post this, but as we were talking about earlier, this is ever evolving. So as soon as we play catch up figuring out what teens are using, we're behind. So staying current is challenging to keep up with that, but definitely, to have a foundational knowledge of this and some place to start. Yeah, we'll definitely post this for everybody to use.
I do also want to add that there are really great resources for educators. So if you're looking for something to do virtually, maybe on a at-home day for your class, we have lots of great resources listed, once again, at rethinkvape.org. There are things you can do for your classroom. They include PowerPoints, Kahoot quizzes, lots of discussion prompts. Everything you might need is on our website, and if you're looking for something in particular, if you're an educator, you can always email vapestudy@evms.edu, and that's me and Emily, and we'll be more than happy to send you what you need.
Great, thanks. Another question we have here. My teen says he's seeing vaping in high school regularly back when we were in session. What are schools doing to protect teens? Maybe a question for Nicole or Sally or Amy around policy.
Hi, yes, I can speak on that really quickly. So last year we actually implemented, we passed tobacco-free school policy. So in Virginia, all public primary and secondary schools actually have a tobacco-free policy. And so for the tobacco control program, I know our regional coordinators, along with Virginia Foundation for Healthy Youth, who focus on more youth tobacco prevention cessation, have reached out to the different schools and trying to offer our assistance as well. So they all should have a tobacco-free policy, and even private schools are working on that as well.
I'll just add that enforcement has been actually a really big challenge for our local schools. These devices, as Anne and Emily were saying earlier in the presentation, are very stealth. They're often very difficult to be able to tell the difference between a magic marker and a vaping device, or a jump drive and a vaping device. So these are very difficult to identify in the schools. A lot of our teachers and administrative staff don't always even know what they look like. And so we do encourage all of our school partners to make sure that they engage their teachers and administrative staff and their parents and PTA in making sure that they are aware of the really the enormity of this problem within schools. We do also know from having done focus groups and surveys with kids across the region that kids here in Hampton Roads do in fact not only use these devices, but they also use them in school during the school day. And while this has been extremely challenging behavior for our schools to even catch kids doing, it is something that is ongoing. And so we would encourage all of our schools to train your teachers, train your administrators, train your parents on what to look for, as well as really think through how do you want to enforce these policies and making sure that you do it fairly. Because a lot of the kids that are using these devices are not the kids that are traditionally in trouble in school. And so for some kids, this may be the first time that they maybe are caught doing something they shouldn't do. It's also very pervasive within athletic teams and associations. So it's very important as well that coaches within school systems learn about these devices, and then also make sure they communicate very clearly to their athletes that they are not to be using these devices and that there are consequences for them when they do use these devices.
Yeah, I'll just piggyback off of that too. Real change happens when those who need it lead it. So if teens, especially those who are teen influencers in their peer group, they kind of start trends in their schools, they could also start a trend to commit to not vaping. Y Street is an organization that's teen led that helped push for tobacco-free anything affiliated with schools, not just during the school day, but on school buses, off-site at games and things too. So I would encourage anybody who's interested in that, and it can be hard if you're a teen to kind of lead something like this, but if you talk to other people about it, you're probably not alone. And it just takes one person to start talking with each other to really figure that out, that not everybody is doing it, even though it might seem that way.
Great. Another viewer asks or shares, a lot of teens use Novos, Novo 2s, and Nords made by Smoke. They are all pod systems. So I suppose seeing if anyone has any knowledge on these types of devices, maybe Paul or Nicole or Emily or Anne.
So generally, pod mod type systems involve nicotine salts, which Anne was talking about earlier. So the use of nicotine salts allows for people to consume much higher levels of nicotine than were possible previously. So So if you saw the slide before that showed the rates of high school student use of e-cigarettes, you saw how when Juul came in, you saw that the rates really jump up. And part of that is because of nicotine salts that can be used, that are oftentimes found in pod systems. So that includes Juul, but it also can include devices made by smoke. And so this allows, again, for a much higher level of nicotine to be consumed, and makes it easier for people to start to get addicted, and use much higher levels of nicotine. So that's certainly something to watch out for. I think Emily had some to share on that as well. I don't know if she had one specifically there. Or...
Well, I was just pointing out that this does have a spot to refill it, so that would be different than, like we were talking about, say like Juuls or like the pot, like the disposables. I'm sure, honestly, unfortunately, they're probably finding a way to even refill those. But that, flavors hook kids, and the ones that are refillable aren't necessarily banned from flavors besides like tobacco or flavor. This is going to be an ongoing problem until it's addressed. So that might be why they're more interested in them, which is unfortunate.
Great, thank you. A viewer asked, as a parent of a 4 and a 6-year-old, at what age should I start talking to my kids about vaping? Maybe a good question for Anne or Emily. Or John, Dr. Harrington as well.
Schools in Virginia actually require, public schools, let me say, in Virginia actually require tobacco education as part of the year-long curriculum. So your children are probably hearing some information about tobacco even then. There are also healthy choice programs in a lot of preschools. But to have maybe a serious conversation about vaping, maybe 5th grade, before they're entering middle school. We're not seeing as much use in elementary school as we are middle school, and of course high school has a much higher use rate. But it's always good to talk to your kids about healthy choices. It doesn't have to be framed necessarily as a vape conversation.
I think it's very interesting, what kids know and what kids see. And so, I use this strategy for parents, who come in and are smoking, have a child with asthma or something like that. And I'll say, the number one reason why your child will smoke is if you smoke. So if the adult is a vapor, or they're vaping around their 4-year-old, that's going to send a message that the child will remember, because they'll know that mom or dad was a vapor, or they're using that thing that looks really cool, and that also, even a 2-year-old, that's why they get into it and ingest it. So it's never too early to talk to a child about what that device is and how dangerous it is and stuff. So if their uncle or aunt or niece or nephew or someone else is using it, I think you would talk to your 4-year-old and 6-year-old and say, that's a dangerous device, and your uncle or aunt may use it, but that doesn't mean that it's proper to use. So I think that conversation needs to happen, especially when it's available and in front of you. You should mention it. You shouldn't disregard it, because when you disregard it, that means you are patently accepting it. So that's one of those things that we have to really say something about it.
Great. A YouTube viewer asks, can kids put cannabis in the vaping device? Is there any smoke or odor? Maybe a good question for Nicole or Paul.
So unfortunately, I've heard a lot of different things about this. I'll just jump in really fast. Remember the Tide Pod challenge? That seems to be kind of a trend with putting different types of things into the pods. Will they work? No clue. But because you're trying different things, it's most likely unhealthy. So just things to keep in mind. Even if used as directed, they're not safe or healthy for kids. So they're, as far as odors go, I'll default to Paul or somebody else for that one.
So people do vape THC, sometimes referred to as wax or shatter, and they can just like the other just like vaping nicotine, different flavors can be used to cover up the scents, to cover up the smell of it. So so it's something else to be on the lookout for, and oftentimes we're seeing, unfortunately, high rates of cannabis use, and the cannabis that is being used nowadays has much higher THC content than what was around in decades past. So it is certainly something to be on the lookout for as well.
Great. Another viewer asks, my child has asthma. Is it safe for her to be around other people who are vaping? Maybe a good question to start with Amy.
Could you repeat one more time? I couldn't hear you.
Is it safe for someone to be around someone who's vaping if they have asthma? Also, Dr. Harrington could chime in.
And certainly, with smoking, we know a lot about it. And one of the things that I think everybody's learned a lot about with smoking regular cigarettes is the idea of secondhand and even third-hand smoke. So secondhand is what's in the air. Third-hand is all the chemicals that deposit on surfaces. So a lot of times, if you've ever been in somebody's house who smoked a lot, you'll notice that things are stained in their house. What we kind of don't know as much about is with vaping, what the long-term effects are of exposure. However, what we do know is that there is a secondhand exposure for vaping. We do recommend, for instance, that parents don't vape around their children. It's an aerosol. And so a lot of times if you've ever been around somebody who's vaping, you'll smell something, and then that person might go, oh, it's just harmless water vapor. Well, it's not actually harmless water vapor, and the smell that you're smelling is actually little tiny pieces of particulate matter getting way down into your lungs. And in particular with vaping, the particulate matter is much, much smaller. So it goes even further down into the lungs. So for somebody who has asthma or what we call airway disease, then they are going to have more trouble when they are around vaping. They're going to have more trouble secondhand or firsthand, whether they're the one vaping or if they're there with friends vaping. So we really recommend that for people who have, particularly for people who have airway disease, that they absolutely avoid this. But also making sure that you're not around it in closed spaces, especially. So in a car. We actually have a lot of great resources on the cinchcoalition.org website around smoking and vaping in cars with children. We certainly don't want you to do that. We don't want teens to be riding with friends who are actively vaping in the car, because there is a secondhand effect even if they are not vaping themselves. And so I would really recommend for our kids with asthma that they stay away, and further recommend that really everybody stay away, because it is an aerosol and it does get into your lungs even if you're not the one that's actually using the device.
Yeah, I would agree with everything Amy said. I think the big issue is because it's an aerosol, because it's a vapor, it actually gets deeper into the lung than probably cigarette smoke. And it's almost an insidious process, because it causes these finer, smaller changes that I think is what's causing the EVALI issue, was that if you're doing it constantly, eventually you change the inner parts of the lung, and that's what's happening with these kids. And it causes such an inflammation that, the kids that were treated in Texas that they just published the report on and stuff is, they needed, high dose steroids to get these kids off of the ventilators and stuff. So it's definitely causing a major problem. Even if you don't have lung disease, you don't have to have asthma to have this give you a problem. So I think that's what's even more sort of insidious about this. You may be a perfect setup for it, even if you have healthy, perfect lungs. But obviously, if you already have somewhat of a airway twitchiness or asthma and stuff like that, you're probably even more at risk.
Thank you. Another question from a viewer. Some teens say they vape nicotine with just flavors, or they vape with just flavors, no nicotine, or THC. Is that possible? So vaping without any nicotine or THC, is it possible? Maybe to Nicole, Anne, or Emily?
So I'll start. As we mentioned earlier, there's not that quality control over these things yet. So in terms of verifying, we have this much in it, and then like the FDA or, governing body has double checked that that's accurate. That's not happening with these products right now. Also, if you think of peanut allergies, the old, and this is the thing that she always says, is if you are making products in a facility that also makes peanut products and you are allergic to peanuts, you should stay away from all of those things. So if, a company is making e-liquids, or not necessarily even just a company, like, people, if they're making these products, there could be cross-contamination, is my point. So you're not exactly sure how much nicotine is in them. The concentrations of them, say they've been around on some shelf for 3 years, is the nicotine content going to be different after, like, I don't know the shelf life of them. There's nothing making anybody prove if that potency is lasting or not. So are you vaping just like nicotine-less products? I can't even say that for sure. And again, the flavors themselves are not shown not to be safe when they're heated at these levels. And then also you have to consider, again, with the devices coming to your mouth and things like that, if people are unfortunately sharing them, like, you're not just getting flavors at that point, you're also, there's different contamination happening as well.
So if I could, I was gonna jump in on that a little bit. So so this is something that we've heard a lot, that teens have said that they're not using nicotine. So teens said that that we're using Juul, and did not realize that they contain nicotine, and all Juul devices contain nicotine. Nicotine is really what drives the use of tobacco. So just as when you drink coffee, you do it for caffeine, or when you drink beer, you do it for the alcohol. There are some people that drink decaf coffee. There are people that drink non-alcoholic beer. Is it common? No, it's really rare. So unfortunately, a lot of people, even adults, aren't aware of what they're actually consuming. So so most likely they are actually getting nicotine or something. There may be people out there, I guess, that enjoy vaping flavors, or that are vaping flavors, but it's got to be very small, and I would assume that it's not the only thing that people are doing.
I wanted to add one thing there, is to really think about that the harm is not just from the nicotine alone. A lot of the flavors, as Anne and Emily both mentioned early on in the presentation, a lot of the flavors have their own chemicals. And while some of these chemicals are purported by the industries to be safe, you might be able to eat something that's approved by the FDA, but when you put it into a vaping device and heat it up to a couple hundred degrees and breathe it into your lungs, it's actually not quite the same substance anymore. And so that's where we're seeing, for instance, like with the Avali, we were seeing other substances that were in those added to a lot of those different mixtures that were probably causing the problem, because they weren't designed to be inhaled. So it's really important to know that if you just do the flavors, that the flavors themselves have a lot of chemicals. The other piece to remember is that even the ones that say nicotine free, just to be very clear, the majority of those that were tested do in fact have at least trace nicotine in them. They are in fact designed to get you to think you're taking a nicotine free product, and to get you addicted to it. And so you want it a little bit more and a little bit more and a little bit more, to the point that eventually you go over and use a full branded nicotine product. So it's very important to understand that this particular industry also has a history of doing this. And in terms of putting cannabis products into the vapes, please do understand, especially for teens, that your brain is developing. And so for teens in particular, because they have a developing brain, using cannabis products can be detrimental to their brain development. So it's really important to understand that that these different products, while they're not nicotine, still come with their own harms.
Great, thank you. Another question from a viewer: are e-cigarettes regulated by the FDA? A great question for maybe Sally or Nicole.
Hi, yes. So they're currently not regulated by the FDA. So I believe it was the cutoff was August 8th of 2016. So all of the e-cigarettes that were not on the market by August 8th, 2016 had to go up with a pre-market review. So basically the FDA has an application, and so all the companies had to submit this application by, I think it was May 12th of this year. It was actually supposed to be due before, but they kept pushing it back and back and back. And so finally it was due May this year. And so the FDA said that they will review all of those within a year, and they will basically review to see if it is safe for the public or not. So technically all the e-cigarettes that have been on sale are technically illegal because they're not approved by the FDA right now.
Great, thank you. So in line with that question, a viewer asked, is the government doing something now besides just labeling? So the different warning labels, maybe just additional information. What is the government doing? Again, maybe to Nicole. Paul, go ahead.
So I was just going to say, so they the industry did apply for an extension on the May deadline due to being shut down because of COVID and so similar concerns that other businesses are having. So that was granted, and so so the new deadline now is September. So other than that, the FDA has done some regulatory actions of sending letters to people that have incredibly egregious actions. So liquid nicotine that looks like apple juice, or things that are just like way out of bounds where they have cracked down on that. They also have banned flavored Juul, for example. So besides menthol and tobacco flavor, so there is, however, some exceptions to that, such as disposable tobacco products. So unfortunately, that has led to some devices such as puff bars that are that they kind of get around that. So they have done some things, but currently, as Nicole said, the FDA has come out and said that right now all e-cigarettes are illegal because they have not gone through this process. They have not submitted applications, and so they have certain enforcement discretion that they're using when some of these kind of really incredibly disturbing kind of products are put out there. But other than that, people really need to understand these are not approved by the FDA. The FDA has said that these are all illegal. There is no e-cigarette that has been approved for the treatment of nicotine dependence. So you're really taking a gamble, people that are using these devices. So it's much better to either talk to a health professional about ways to quit or just stop using on your own, or use some of the resources that we've discussed before.
Another important thing that has developed from the federal government is Tobacco 21 is now the law of the land. So there were localities and states that had passed that, including Virginia. And one of the great things about the federal Tobacco 21 change as well is it actually somewhat strengthened our own Tobacco 21 law here in Virginia, because we previously had a carve out for active military. So anyone who was an active military member who was 18 or older was also able to purchase tobacco. They had that exemption. And so the federal law actually did away with that particular part of our own Tobacco 21 bill. So that has been a great improvement that we've seen, and hopefully we'll be seeing the long-term effects of that, making products less accessible to young people.
Great, thank you. Another question from a viewer. My teen smokes cigarettes. Is it better for him to vape? Dr. Harrington?
I lost my screen there for a little bit, and I lost my thought process. So, it's sort of one of those things. I think in the adult world, there's been some conflicting reports related to, using vaping to get your amount of nicotine down, in order to be able to more easily quit. If a teen has been smoking for a very long time and they're up to a pack a day and, something like that, then there might be, an older teen might, sort of fit into that category of possibly doing something like that. But we probably would traditionally just say, let's just do the nicotine replacement therapy, or Chantix or something like that before going down the road of using something that really hasn't been approved yet as a therapy for kids, teenagers and stuff. So, and most teenagers haven't developed the same level of addiction, maybe than an adult would have if they've been smoking for 10 or 15 years and stuff. So, it's hoped that they haven't. I mean, usually most people don't start smoking a pack a day. They usually start with 2 or 3 cigarettes, or 2 or 3. If we're vaping, then it's different, but it would be like 2 or 3 cigarettes. So, I would suggest just having them stop, not using vaping as a whatever, a bridge to actually stopping. I probably wouldn't do that.
Great. Thank you. That is all the questions that I have at the moment from Facebook and YouTube. So Kelly, I will pass it back to you for any last comments.
Thank you. Thanks, Sarah. I'd like to thank everyone for joining our conversation tonight. This has really been a lively discussion, and I appreciate all of your helpful responses and your thoughtful questions from the audience. Please feel free to reach out via vapestudy@evms.edu if you have additional questions or would like us to work with you regarding some of the educational needs that you might have. We'd be happy to work with you. Thank you, and have a great night, everyone.
Please stand by. Please stand by.